In the affluent suburb of Westfield Commons, Connecticut, a 72-year-old retired mathematics professor was about to face the most humiliating moment of her life. What began as a family dinner to discuss mom's recent forgetfulness quickly escalated into a full-scale intervention when her children dismissed her as mentally declining. But Dorothy Chen-Williams wasn't your typical elderly widow losing her faculties. For 45 years, she had calculated complex equations and managed intricate financial systems as head of the mathematics department at Yale University. When her ungrateful children suggested memory care facilities, they had no idea that their mother's supposedly failing mind held the exact locations of $847,000 in hidden college funds. Money they desperately needed but had no idea existed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Dorothy Chen-Williams adjusted her reading glasses and surveyed the formal dining room that had hosted countless faculty dinners during her husband Robert's tenure as Dean of Engineering. The mahogany table gleamed under the crystal chandelier, its surface reflecting the careful arrangement of her finest china, the Lenox set Robert had given her for their 20th anniversary. She'd prepared her famous pot roast, the same recipe that had impressed university colleagues for decades, though she wondered if any of her 3 children would even notice the effort. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd spent 45 years teaching probability and statistics, yet she'd failed to calculate the odds of raising 3 financially irresponsible adults who would one day sit in judgment of her mental capacity. At 68, her eldest son Jonathan had inherited his father's engineering precision but none of his fiscal responsibility. He'd arrived 15 minutes early, as always, positioning himself in Robert's old chair at the head of the table, with the territorial confidence of someone who believed he was now the family's de facto leader. His wife Patricia sat beside him, her manicured fingers already reaching for her iPhone to document what Dorothy suspected would become evidence of her decline. "Mom, you look wonderful," Jonathan said, his voice carrying that careful modulation people used with hospital patients or small children. "Patricia and I were just saying how good you look for your age." Dorothy bit back her first response, that 72 wasn't ancient, and she'd been solving differential equations while Patricia was still struggling with basic algebra. Instead, she smiled and continued setting the table, her mathematician's mind automatically calculating the subtext behind their early arrival and overly solicitous behavior. Her daughter Amanda entered next, bringing with her the perpetual air of controlled chaos that had defined her adult life. At 65, Amanda managed a small interior design firm that consistently operated on the edge of bankruptcy, despite handling projects for some of Connecticut's wealthiest families. Her artistic temperament, which Robert had always encouraged, had translated into a complete inability to balance a checkbook or plan beyond the current fiscal quarter. "Sorry I'm late, Mom," Amanda said, kissing Dorothy's cheek while simultaneously texting on her phone. "Client emergency. Mrs. Pemberton decided she hates the wallpaper we installed last week and wants everything redone before her garden party." The third arrival was her youngest son, Marcus, whose 45 minutes of tardiness was par for the course. At 61, Marcus had drifted through life with the casual confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences. His succession of failed business ventures, from the organic dog treat company to the artisanal coffee roasting operation, had been funded by Dorothy and Robert's increasingly reluctant loans. He entered with his characteristic sheepish grin, carrying a bottle of wine that Dorothy recognized as one from her own cellar. "Traffic was murder," he announced, though Dorothy knew he'd likely spent the extra time in his car, gathering courage for whatever conversation they'd planned. "Hope I didn't miss anything important." As her children settled around the table, Dorothy felt the familiar weight of disappointment that had accumulated over decades of watching brilliant potential dissolve into comfortable mediocrity. These were individuals she'd sacrificed for, worked extra hours to support, and whose education she'd prioritized above her own career advancement. Yet somewhere along the way, they'd stopped seeing her as the woman who'd navigated university politics, published groundbreaking research, and managed complex financial portfolios. To them, she'd become simply Mom, a convenient source of emotional and financial support whose own needs and capabilities were increasingly invisible. The dinner conversation began pleasantly enough, with updates about grandchildren's achievements and social commitments. Dorothy listened to Amanda's detailed account of her latest design project, mentally calculating that the timeline and budget her daughter described were mathematically impossible, given the scope of work involved. She nodded at Jonathan's discussion of his engineering consulting firm's new government contract, noting the slight defensive edge in his voice that suggested the project wasn't proceeding as smoothly as he claimed. Marcus, predictably, had no updates to share about employment or relationships, instead regaling them with stories about his latest hobby, restoring vintage motorcycles. Dorothy found herself wondering how someone could afford motorcycle restoration, while consistently claiming to be, quote, between opportunities financially. It was during dessert, her homemade apple pie, prepared from scratch despite her supposedly declining faculties, that the conversation's true purpose finally emerged. "Mom," Jonathan began, setting down his fork with deliberate precision, "we wanted to talk to you about something important. We've all been concerned about some changes we've noticed." Dorothy felt her body tense despite having anticipated this moment. The careful orchestration of their gathering, the overly attentive behavior, the way they'd all arrived within a narrow time frame, it had all pointed toward a planned intervention disguised as a family dinner. "Changes?" she repeated, her voice maintaining the calm neutrality she'd perfected during faculty meetings, where colleagues attempted to undermine her authority. Amanda leaned forward, her expression radiating the kind of earnest concern typically reserved for stray animals or natural disaster victims. "We've noticed you've been more forgetful lately. Little things, but they're adding up. Like last week when you called me Daniel," Marcus added, referring to Robert's brother who died 15 years earlier. "And you seemed confused about what day it was when Jonathan stopped by." Dorothy remembered both incidents clearly. She'd called Marcus by his uncle's name because he'd been telling the exact same story about motorcycle restoration that Daniel used to tell about his classic cars. The same meandering narrative style, the same assumption that everyone found his hobbies fascinating. As for the confusion about days, she'd been deep in concentration, working on a complex mathematical proof that had been eluding her for weeks. When absorbed in serious intellectual work, she'd always lost track of mundane details like dates and times. But explaining this to her children would require them to acknowledge that she still engaged in serious intellectual work, and she suspected they'd unconsciously written off that possibility years ago. "And there was the incident with Mrs. Henderson from next door," Patricia added, consulting notes on her phone with the efficiency of someone building a legal case. "She said you seemed disoriented when you were discussing the neighborhood watch meeting." Dorothy almost laughed. Mrs. Henderson was 84 years old and had been repeating the same 3 stories about suspicious activity for the past decade. Dorothy's apparent disorientation had actually been polite patience while listening to familiar concerns about teenagers walking through the neighborhood and delivery trucks that stayed parked too long. "We're not trying to embarrass you, Mom," Jonathan continued, his tone suggesting he absolutely was trying to embarrass her into compliance. "But we think it might be time to consider getting some help. Professional evaluation, maybe looking into assisted living communities that specialize in memory care." The phrase memory care hit Dorothy like a physical blow, not because it frightened her, but because it revealed how completely her children had rewritten her identity. In their minds, she'd already transitioned from brilliant mathematics professor to elderly woman with memory problems. The Dorothy who'd published papers on advanced statistical analysis, who'd managed the department's multi-million-dollar research budget, who'd solved problems that stumped colleagues half her age, that woman had apparently ceased to exist. "Memory care," she repeated, letting the words hang in the air while she processed the full scope of their presumption. "There are some lovely facilities," Amanda said quickly, producing a folder of printed materials with the efficiency of someone who'd been researching for weeks. "Sunset Manor has beautiful gardens and an excellent activities program. They specialize in maintaining dignity and independence while providing necessary support." Dorothy scanned the glossy brochures, noting the euphemistic language and carefully staged photographs of elderly residents engaged in craft projects and gentle exercise classes. These were warehouses for discarded family members, places where inconvenient aging parents could be professionally managed by people paid to provide the patience and attention their own children couldn't be bothered to offer. The financial aspect would be manageable, Jonathan added, apparently having already researched costs and payment options. "Between your pension, Dad's life insurance, and the equity in this house, There would be sufficient funds for quality care. There it was, the underlying motivation that Dorothy had suspected but hoped to avoid confronting. Her children weren't concerned about her welfare. They were concerned about their inheritance. In their calculation, she'd become a liability, someone whose continued independence threatened their future financial security. Better to warehouse her in professional care while her assets could be carefully managed and preserved. Dorothy set down her coffee cup with deliberate care, her mathematician's mind shifting into the analytical mode that had served her throughout her academic career. The variables were clear. 3 adult children who'd consistently demonstrated poor financial judgment, significant assets they believed they understood, and a presumption of her declining capacity that would justify their assumption of control. What they didn't know, what they'd never bothered to learn, was that Dorothy had spent the past 15 years carefully calculating their financial futures and making decisions based on projections they couldn't even comprehend. "Before we discuss my supposed memory problems," she said, her voice carrying the authority that had commanded respect in lecture halls and faculty meetings, "perhaps we should discuss your actual financial problems." The room fell silent except for the ticking of Robert's grandfather clock in the hallway. Dorothy looked at each of her children in turn, seeing the slight tightening around Jonathan's eyes, the way Amanda's hands stilled on her phone, the nervous laugh that escaped from Marcus before he could stop it. They'd come here to manage her, to take control of her life and assets, based on their assessment of her declining capacity. They had no idea that her supposedly failing memory contained precise knowledge of every financial mistake they'd made, every debt they'd hidden, every desperate circumstance they thought they'd successfully concealed. The intervention was about to become something none of them had anticipated, and Dorothy found herself almost looking forward to their reaction when they discovered exactly how much their forgetful mother actually remembered about their carefully hidden financial disasters. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The silence that followed Dorothy's statement stretched like a taut wire, each second adding weight to the unspoken tension in the dining room. Jonathan's fork clinked against his dessert plate as he set it down, the small sound amplified in the sudden quiet. Patricia's thumb hovered over her phone screen, apparently frozen mid-text. Amanda's interior designer instincts for reading room dynamics kicked in, and she shifted uncomfortably in her chair, while Marcus attempted his usual deflecting grin, but couldn't quite manage it. Dorothy pushed back from the table slightly, creating the kind of physical space that mathematics had taught her was necessary for clear thinking. She'd spent decades observing student behavior during exams, learning to read the subtle signs of panic, preparation, and deception. Her children were displaying a fascinating combination of all 3. "Mom," Jonathan began, his engineering background asserting itself as he attempted to regain control of the conversation's trajectory. "I'm not sure what you mean about financial problems. We're all doing quite well, actually." Dorothy almost smiled at the predictable response. In academic settings, when students were caught unprepared, they invariably tried to redirect rather than address the specific challenge. It was a defensive mechanism she'd seen thousands of times, and it never worked with her then, just as it wouldn't work now. "Are you Jonathan?" she asked, her voice maintaining the calm inquiry tone that had unnerved graduate students for decades. "Because according to my calculations, your consulting firm is approximately 97 days from insolvency, assuming current burn rate and accounts receivable patterns." The color drained from Jonathan's face with mathematical precision. Patricia's phone clattered onto the table as she stared at Dorothy with undisguised shock. The government contract Jonathan had mentioned earlier, the one he'd described as a significant win for his firm, was actually a desperate Hail Mary attempt to stave off bankruptcy proceedings that had been looming for months. "How could you possibly—" Jonathan's voice trailed off as he processed the implications of his mother's statement. He hadn't told anyone about the firm's financial troubles. Not even Patricia. The stress of managing declining revenues while maintaining the appearance of success had been eating away at him for the better part of a year. Dorothy continued with the methodical precision of someone presenting a mathematical proof. "The Patterson engineering account receivable, $347,000 for the bridge inspection project, has been outstanding for 6 months. They're disputing your findings because your structural analysis contained what they're calling, quote, significant computational errors, though I suspect the real issue is that you rushed the calculations to meet an impossible deadline." Jonathan's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. The Patterson dispute was supposed to be confidential, tied up in legal proceedings that could drag on for years. His mother wasn't supposed to know about it, let alone understand the technical details of why the payment was being withheld. "The Hartford municipal contract," Dorothy continued, consulting what appeared to be perfect memory but felt more like accessing a mental filing system, was supposed to provide operating capital for 18 months. Instead, you've been burning through it at accelerated rates because you've been paying premium rates for subcontractors to handle work your staff should be doing. This is because you've been avoiding layoffs to maintain the appearance of business stability." Patricia found her voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Jonathan, is this true?" Before he could answer, Dorothy smoothly shifted her attention to Amanda, who had been growing increasingly pale as she realized her turn was coming. "Amanda's situation is perhaps more immediately dire," Dorothy said, her tone suggesting she was discussing weather patterns rather than financial catastrophe. "Creative Interiors owes $73,000 to various suppliers, with payment terms that expired between 2 and 8 weeks ago. The Pemberton project you mentioned, the one with the wallpaper crisis, represents your last chance to generate sufficient cash flow to avoid bankruptcy proceedings." Amanda's artistic composure cracked entirely. "Mom, how do you— I never told anyone about the supplier problems." "You didn't need to tell me," Dorothy replied. "I've been tracking your business finances since you started the company. Did you really think I wouldn't notice when you stopped making regular deposits into your business account, or when you started using personal credit cards for what should have been business expenses?" The implications of her mother's words hit Amanda like a physical blow. If Dorothy had been monitoring her business accounts, she knew about more than just the supplier debts. She knew about the credit card advances Amanda had been using to cover payroll, about the second mortgage she'd taken on her house to fund the business, about the increasingly desperate measures she'd been taking to keep Creative Interiors afloat. But the real financial crisis in this family, Dorothy continued, turning her attention to Marcus, belongs to our perpetually optimistic entrepreneur here. Marcus's attempt at his usual carefree demeanor dissolved entirely. Of the 3 siblings, he'd always been the most transparent about his financial struggles, but Dorothy suspected his problems ran deeper than even his characteristic openness had revealed. "The motorcycle restoration hobby," Dorothy said, her voice taking on the tone she'd once used to explain particularly complex theorems to struggling students, "is actually a desperate attempt to flip vintage bikes for profit. You've invested $47,000 in motorcycles that you purchased based on online research rather than mechanical expertise. The 3 bikes currently in your garage are worth approximately $31,000 in their current condition, assuming you could find buyers willing to pay fair market value." Marcus slumped in his chair as if the numbers themselves carried physical weight. The motorcycle venture had been his most recent attempt to create income without traditional employment. But like most of his business ideas, it had been based more on enthusiasm than expertise. "But the motorcycles aren't your primary financial concern," Dorothy continued with relentless precision. "Your primary concern is the $127,000 you owe to various creditors, including $23,000 to your former business partner from the coffee roasting venture, $31,000 in combined credit card debt, and $73,000 in consolidated loans that you took out to pay off previous business debts." The room had become absolutely silent, except for the steady ticking of Robert's grandfather clock, and the sound of 3 adult children trying to process how their supposedly declining mother had gained access to financial information they'd been carefully concealing from each other, let alone from her. Dorothy stood and began clearing dessert plates with the same methodical efficiency she'd brought to grading exams. The simple domestic action provided a stark contrast to the devastating accuracy of her financial revelations, and she found the juxtaposition almost amusing. "The truly fascinating aspect of your individual financial crises," she continued while stacking dishes, "is how they've created a convergent situation where you're all facing similar timelines for catastrophic failure. Jonathan's firm needs immediate capital injection to survive beyond the next quarter. Amanda's business requires approximately $80,000 to achieve basic solvency. Marcus needs debt consolidation and living expenses while he develops an actual income stream. She paused in her clearing to look at each of her children in turn, noting how her analysis had stripped away their carefully maintained facades. These were adults who'd spent decades projecting success while privately struggling with increasingly desperate financial circumstances. "This is why you're here tonight," Dorothy concluded. "Not because you're concerned about my memory or my welfare, but because you've calculated that gaining control of my assets represents your collective salvation. You've decided that I'm sufficiently diminished to justify assuming financial guardianship, which would allow you to access funds that could solve your immediate problems." Jonathan found his voice first, though it lacked its usual authoritative tone. "Mom, even if we were having financial difficulties, and I'm not confirming that, it doesn't change our concern about your mental state. How do you even know these things about our private finances?" Dorothy smiled for the first time since the conversation had begun, and her children recognized the expression from their childhood. The look she got when a student asked exactly the right question, even if they didn't realize it. "That's an excellent question, Jonathan," she said, settling back into her chair with the satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting for the proper opening. "How does a woman with supposed memory problems maintain such detailed knowledge of complex financial situations? How does someone who allegedly gets confused about what day it is track multiple business accounts, credit reports, and investment portfolios with mathematical precision?" She reached into the sideboard behind her and withdrew a leather portfolio that her children had probably assumed contained old photographs or recipe collections. Instead, she opened it to reveal detailed financial spreadsheets, printed reports, and handwritten calculations that demonstrated months of careful analysis. "The answer is quite simple," Dorothy continued, spreading some of the documents across the cleared table. "I don't have memory problems. I have a mathematics PhD and 45 years of experience managing complex financial systems. What I've been doing is solving a very interesting probability problem. Given 3 adult children with demonstrated histories of poor financial decision-making, what are the optimal strategies for ensuring their long-term economic stability while protecting family assets from their shorter-term impulses?" Amanda leaned forward to examine the documents, her design-trained eye immediately recognizing the sophistication of the analysis. These weren't casual observations or lucky guesses. They represented serious financial research conducted with professional-level expertise. "You've been studying us?" Marcus asked, sounding more curious than offended. "I've been protecting you," Dorothy corrected. "From yourselves, primarily, but also from the consequences of decisions you've been making without adequate information or long-term planning." Patricia, who had remained largely silent throughout the revelation, finally spoke up. "Mrs. Williams, this is extraordinary, but it doesn't address our concerns about the incidents we mentioned. The confusion, the memory lapses." Dorothy turned her attention to her daughter-in-law, appreciating the attempt to maintain focus on their original intervention agenda. "Patricia, you're referring to behavioral observations made by people who've unconsciously decided I'm no longer intellectually capable. When someone expects to see decline, they interpret normal variations in attention and social engagement as evidence of diminishment." She pulled out another set of documents, these showing academic work and correspondence with former colleagues. "I've been working on a research paper about optimal resource allocation in family financial planning. The work requires deep concentration and complex calculations. When I appear confused about mundane social interactions, it's because I'm typically engaged with mathematical problems that require more cognitive resources than small talk about neighborhood watch meetings." The revelation was settling over her children like a slowly lifting fog. Their mother wasn't declining. She was actively working, researching, and planning at a level that exceeded anything they'd imagined possible for someone her age. "So when you called me Daniel," Marcus began, "you were telling Daniel's exact story about motorcycle restoration, using his speech patterns and even some of his specific phrases," Dorothy explained patiently. "After listening to him tell those stories for 20 years, and then hearing you repeat them almost verbatim, the name association was perfectly logical." Jonathan was studying the financial documents with growing amazement and concern. "Mom, this level of detail about our personal finances, how did you gather all this information?" Dorothy's smile became slightly mysterious. That, my dear son, brings us to the heart of tonight's discussion. You see, your assumption that I've been declining has blinded you to some very important realities about what I've actually been doing with my time, my resources, and my supposedly failing memory. She gathered the documents back into the portfolio with practiced efficiency. But before we discuss my methods, I think we need to address the more fundamental question. What did you imagine would happen to your inheritance if I were to enter memory care, as you've been suggesting? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Dorothy could see her children beginning to realize that their carefully planned intervention had revealed far more about their own motivations than about her alleged cognitive decline. The evening was far from over, and Dorothy found herself looking forward to the next phase of her revelation with the same anticipation she'd once felt before delivering a particularly elegant mathematical proof to a challenging audience. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, its resonant tones filling the dining room, as Dorothy's children sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of their miscalculation. What they'd intended as a gentle intervention to address their mother's declining faculties had transformed into something resembling a financial audit conducted by someone with access to information that should have been impossible to obtain. Dorothy rose from her chair and moved to the bay window that overlooked her meticulously maintained garden, where Robert's prized rose bushes caught the last rays of evening sunlight. The familiar view provided her with a moment to appreciate the irony of the situation. Her children had come here believing they needed to protect her from her own diminished capacity, never imagining they might need protection from her enhanced capabilities. "The question you should be asking," she said without turning from the window, "isn't how I know about your financial problems. The question is why I've been investigating them so thoroughly." Jonathan cleared his throat, his engineering mind struggling to process variables that didn't fit his assumptions about his mother's limitations. "Mom, you're talking about detailed financial surveillance of your own children. That's not normal behavior, regardless of your capabilities." Dorothy turned back to face them, noting how each had unconsciously shifted their posture during her moment at the window. Amanda had pushed her chair back slightly from the table, creating psychological distance from the documents that contained her business secrets. Marcus had slumped forward, his usual defensive humor replaced by genuine concern about what other revelations might be coming. Patricia continued taking notes on her phone, though Dorothy suspected the woman was no longer documenting evidence of decline, but rather trying to understand the scope of what they'd stumbled into. "Normal behavior," Dorothy repeated, settling back into her chair with the measured precision of someone preparing to deliver a complex lecture. "Let me tell you about normal behavior, Jonathan. Normal behavior would have been 3 responsible adults managing their finances competently, planning for their future sensibly, and maintaining open communication with their family about significant challenges they were facing." She pulled out a different folder from her portfolio, this one containing what appeared to be a timeline with dates, locations, and detailed observations. "Instead, what I observed over the past 18 months was a pattern of increasingly desperate financial decisions, made by people who seem to have no long-term planning capabilities whatsoever." Amanda leaned forward despite herself, her curiosity overriding her discomfort. 18 months? You've been watching us for 18 months? I've been caring about you for your entire lives, Dorothy corrected gently. "But yes, the systematic observation began 18 months ago, when I noticed certain behavioral patterns that suggested significant underlying stressors." She opened the timeline and spread it across the table, revealing a document that looked more like a research project than casual family monitoring. Dates were cross-referenced with locations, phone calls, and even social media activity, all organized with the methodical precision of someone trained in data analysis and pattern recognition. "Marcus, for example," she continued, pointing to a series of entries from the previous spring. "March 15th. You visited me for what you claimed was a casual lunch, but you spent the entire meal steering the conversation toward Robert's life insurance policy and asking seemingly innocent questions about estate planning. March 22nd, you called to ask if I needed help organizing my financial documents. March 29th, you suggested I might want to consider consolidating my various investment accounts for easier management." Marcus shifted uncomfortably as his mother recited the timeline of his increasingly transparent attempts to assess her financial situation. What he'd thought were subtle inquiries had apparently been recognized immediately for what they were: reconnaissance missions designed to evaluate potential resources for his growing debt problems. The pattern suggested someone facing immediate financial pressure who was beginning to view family assets as potential solutions. Dorothy continued with clinical detachment. So I began investigating what kind of pressure might be driving such behavior. Jonathan interrupted, his voice tight with a mixture of embarrassment and indignation. You investigated us? Your own children? I researched publicly available information about people I love who seemed to be in trouble but weren't asking for help, Dorothy clarified. There's a significant difference between investigation and research, though I suspect the distinction is lost on people who prefer to hide their problems rather than address them directly. She pulled out another section of documents, these showing printouts from business registration databases, court filings, and credit reporting agencies. Marcus's business ventures, for instance, are matters of public record. The coffee roasting company's bankruptcy filing, the business licenses for ventures that never generated reportable income, the liens filed by unpaid creditors, all available through basic research. Marcus stared at the documents containing his business failures laid out in chronological order. You looked up court records? I looked up everything I could legally access, Dorothy replied matter-of-factly. When someone you love is clearly struggling but won't discuss the problem, responsible caring requires understanding the scope of the situation. She turned to Amanda, whose interior design business had left a surprisingly detailed paper trail of its financial troubles. Your business problems weren't difficult to track either, Amanda. Vendor complaints filed with the Better Business Bureau, unpaid contractor liens filed with the county clerk's office, commercial credit reports that are accessible to anyone willing to pay the nominal fees. Amanda's face flushed as she realized the extent of her mother's research. You paid for credit reports on us? I paid for information that would help me understand how to help you, Dorothy corrected. Though I notice none of you have asked whether I've actually been helping. The question hung in the air like a mathematical proof waiting to be solved. Patricia looked up from her note-taking with the expression of someone who just realized she'd been asking the wrong questions entirely. What do you mean, helping? She asked carefully. Dorothy smiled with the satisfaction of a professor whose students had finally arrived at the crucial inquiry. I mean that while you've been struggling with your individual financial crises in isolation, I've been working on comprehensive solutions that address not just your immediate problems, but your long-term financial stability. She reached into her portfolio and withdrew a thicker folder, this one containing documents that appeared to be financial projections, investment strategies, and detailed planning scenarios. The question that began this entire research project was quite straightforward. Given 3 adult children with demonstrated patterns of poor financial decision-making, how can family resources be deployed to provide genuine assistance without enabling continued irresponsibility? Jonathan leaned forward, his engineering background responding to the systematic approach his mother was describing. You're talking about conditional assistance. I'm talking about structured support designed to address root causes rather than symptoms, Dorothy replied. Simply providing money to people who've demonstrated they can't manage money effectively is neither kind nor helpful. It's enabling behavior that will ultimately create larger problems. She opened the planning documents to reveal what appeared to be individual financial rehabilitation plans for each of her children, complete with timeline projections, milestone requirements, and resource allocation strategies. For example, Amanda, she said, turning to pages marked with her daughter's name, your business has excellent potential if you can resolve the cash flow management issues that have plagued every project, rather than simply paying off your current debts, which would leave you vulnerable to repeating the same mistakes. I've developed a plan that addresses the systematic problems in your business model. Amanda stared at the documents, recognizing detailed analysis of her company's operational patterns, client payment schedules, and resource allocation inefficiencies. You've analyzed my entire business? I've analyzed the structural problems that keep creating financial crises for your business, Dorothy clarified. The solutions require changes in how you approach project management, client contracts, and cash flow forecasting. Simply throwing money at the immediate problems would be like treating symptoms while ignoring the underlying disease. She turned to Marcus's section, which contained what appeared to be a comprehensive career development strategy combined with debt consolidation planning. Marcus, Your pattern of failed business ventures stems from a fundamental mismatch between your entrepreneurial enthusiasm and your practical business skills. Rather than funding another venture that's likely to fail, I've researched opportunities that build on your actual strengths while providing structured learning for areas where you need development. Marcus examined the documents with growing amazement. His mother had identified career opportunities he'd never considered, analyzed his personality profile for business compatibility, and even researched potential mentors in fields that might suit his interests while offering realistic income potential. And Jonathan, Dorothy continued, opening the most complex section of her planning documents, your consulting firm's problems aren't fundamentally about lack of capital. They're about systematic underpricing of services and poor project management protocols. The solutions require operational changes that will prevent future cash flow crises, not just emergency funding to address the current one. Jonathan studied the operational analysis his mother had prepared, recognizing recommendations that addressed problems he'd been struggling with for months. This is professional-level business consulting. It's mathematics applied to business problems, Dorothy replied. I've been solving complex systems for 45 years. Business operations are just another type of system that responds to mathematical analysis. Patricia set down her phone entirely, apparently abandoning her note-taking in favor of trying to understand the full scope of what Dorothy had accomplished. Mrs. Williams, this represents months of intensive research and analysis. When did you have time to do all this work? Dorothy's expression became slightly mysterious again. That brings us to another interesting aspect of this situation. You've all assumed that my recent behavioral changes, the periods of distraction, the decreased interest in social activities, the times when I seemed confused about routine matters, indicated cognitive decline. She gestured toward the comprehensive planning documents spread across the table. In reality, those changes reflected the intense concentration required for complex problem solving. When you're engaged in serious analytical work, mundane social interactions become annoying interruptions rather than pleasant diversions. Amanda nodded slowly, recognizing the behavior from her own experience with demanding design projects. You were working, that's why you seemed distracted. I was working on the most important project of my retirement, Dorothy confirmed. Solving the financial futures of my 3 children while they were too proud, too embarrassed, or too overwhelmed to ask for help directly. Marcus looked up from the career development documents with an expression mixing gratitude and bewilderment. Mom, this is incredible work, but how did you know we needed help if we weren't asking for it? Dorothy leaned back in her chair, her mathematician's mind appreciating the elegant way the conversation had progressed toward the question she'd been waiting for them to ask. Because, she said with the confidence of someone who'd solved a particularly challenging equation, I've been tracking patterns in your behavior, communication, and decision-making for years. The mathematical probability of 3 siblings independently developing serious financial problems within the same 18-month period, without any communication about those problems, and while simultaneously beginning to show increased interest in their elderly mother's estate planning, approaches 0. She paused to let the statistical reality sink in, which meant that either you were all experiencing unprecedented financial pressure, or you were coordinating your approach to gaining access to family resources. Since coordination would have required the kind of communication and planning skills that might have prevented your individual financial problems in the first place, the logical conclusion was that you were all struggling independently. The room fell silent as her children processed the mathematical elegance of her analysis. Dorothy had approached their problems like a researcher, identifying variables, testing hypotheses, and developing solutions based on empirical evidence rather than emotional assumptions. But the most interesting discovery, Dorothy continued, came when I began calculating the total resources required to implement comprehensive solutions for all 3 of your situations simultaneously. She reached for one final document, this one marked with calculations that appeared to represent significant financial figures. The amount needed to address your immediate problems, fund the systematic changes required for long-term stability, and provide adequate safety margins for unexpected complications is quite substantial. Jonathan leaned forward, his engineering mind instinctively drawn to the precision of his mother's calculations. How substantial? Dorothy's smile carried the satisfaction of someone who'd saved the most important revelation for last. Approximately $847,000 for complete implementation of all 3 rehabilitation plans, including debt consolidation, business recapitalization, career development funding, and 18-month living expense buffers while new systems are established. The figure hung in the air like a mathematical constant, precise and immutable. It was more money than any of them had imagined might be required, and far more than they'd expected their mother to have access to, even with her pension, Robert's life insurance, and the value of the house. "Mom," Amanda said carefully, "that's a very specific figure. It's the exact amount needed for optimal outcomes," Dorothy replied. "I don't deal in approximations when precision is possible." Marcus looked between his siblings and back to his mother, a new question forming in his mind. Do you have access to that kind of money?" Dorothy's expression became inscrutable as she began gathering the documents back into her portfolio. "That," she said with the tone of someone preparing to reveal the most important information of the evening, "depends on whether you're still convinced I'm losing my memory." The challenge was clear, and her children found themselves facing a choice they hadn't anticipated when they'd arrived for what they'd planned as a simple intervention. They could continue insisting their mother needed memory care, in which case they'd likely never learn about resources that could solve their financial problems. Or they could acknowledge that their assumptions about her declining faculties had been completely wrong, opening the door to possibilities they'd never imagined. The evening had become a negotiation, and Dorothy held all the cards. The tension in the dining room had shifted from confrontational to negotiative, but Dorothy could sense her children's growing frustration with the careful pace of her revelations. Jonathan's engineering mind was clearly working overtime, trying to calculate how his supposedly declining mother could have access to nearly $1 million in liquid assets. Amanda sat forward with the focused attention she typically reserved for difficult clients, while Marcus had abandoned his usual casual demeanor entirely. Patricia broke the silence first, her practical nature cutting through the emotional complexity of the family dynamics. "Mrs. Williams, with all due respect, the figure you mentioned, $847,000, represents more liquid capital than most retirees have access to, even with substantial savings and life insurance. Are you suggesting you have that kind of money available?" Dorothy appreciated the directness of the question, though she noted the subtle skepticism in Patricia's tone. Her daughter-in-law was clearly running calculations of her own, probably based on assumptions about typical retirement savings and the lifestyle Dorothy had maintained since Robert's death. "I'm suggesting," Dorothy replied carefully, "that assumptions about what resources are available often prove to be incomplete when they're based on limited information." She stood and moved to the antique secretary desk that had belonged to Robert's grandmother, running her fingers along the intricate woodwork that had always fascinated her with its hidden compartments and secret mechanisms. The desk had been a wedding gift from Robert's family, and over the years it had come to symbolize the way important things could be concealed in plain sight. "For instance," she continued, opening the desk's main drawer and withdrawing a small leather-bound journal, "you've all assumed that your father and I lived on my professor's salary and his engineering income, saving what we could in traditional retirement accounts and making conservative investments appropriate for academics." Jonathan shifted impatiently. "Mom, we've seen Dad's financial records. We helped you organize them after he died. There weren't any hidden assets or secret accounts." Dorothy smiled as she opened the journal to reveal pages covered with her precise handwriting, dates, figures, and calculations that appeared to span several decades. "You saw the financial records that Robert maintained for routine household management and standard retirement planning, but you didn't see the records for what he called our, quote, enhanced financial strategy." She returned to her chair, the journal open to a page that showed calculations from nearly 30 years earlier. "Your father was a brilliant engineer, but he was also something else that none of you fully appreciated. He was a patent holder whose innovations generated substantial licensing revenues throughout his career." Amanda blinked in surprise. "Dad had patents?" "Your father held 17 patents for engineering processes and materials applications," Dorothy replied, consulting the journal. "Most were developed during his tenure at the university, but several were the result of independent research he conducted in our basement workshop." Marcus straightened in his chair. "The workshop? I thought that was just Dad's hobby area." Dorothy's expression softened with memory. "Your father's hobby, was developing solutions to engineering problems that major corporations couldn't solve efficiently. The licensing agreements for his innovations generated revenue streams that continued long after the initial development work was completed. She turned several pages in the journal, revealing detailed records of patent licensing payments, royalty schedules, and revenue projections that painted a picture of financial complexity none of her children had suspected. Patent 4,789,234 for stress distribution algorithms in bridge construction, she read from one entry, licensed to Morrison Engineering in 1987, generating annual royalties averaging $47,000 through 2019. Patent 6,234,891 for corrosion-resistant material composites, licensed to 3 different manufacturers, combined annual revenue averaging $73,000. Jonathan stared at his mother with growing amazement. "I never knew about any of this. Why didn't Dad tell us?" Dorothy looked up from the journal, her expression carrying the weight of years of careful financial strategy. "Because your father understood something about human nature that took me longer to appreciate. People who know about money they haven't earned often develop inappropriate expectations about access to that money." The observation hit the room like a small explosion. Each of her children recognized the uncomfortable truth in her statement. Knowing about significant family wealth would have changed their approach to their own financial responsibilities. "More importantly," Dorothy continued, "your father believed that financial independence was something each person needed to achieve through their own efforts. The patent revenues were intended to provide family security and emergency resources, not to subsidize poor financial decision-making." She turned to a section of the journal marked with red tabs, revealing calculations that appeared to track the accumulation of patent revenues over decades. "However, your father also believed in education. Every dollar of patent revenue that we didn't need for our immediate expenses was designated for what he called the Family Education Fund." Patricia leaned forward, her note-taking resuming as she began to understand the scope of what Dorothy was revealing. "Education fund?" "Initially, the fund was intended to ensure that all of you could attend college without financial constraints," Dorothy explained. "Your father calculated that the patent revenues, properly invested and compounded over time, would provide sufficient resources for undergraduate and graduate education for 3 children, plus potential educational support for grandchildren." Amanda's design-trained mind was beginning to grasp the mathematical implications. "Mom, if Dad was generating that kind of income for decades, and it was being invested rather than spent, the compound growth would be substantial," Dorothy confirmed. "Especially considering that your father approached investment strategy with the same methodical precision he brought to engineering problems." She opened to another section of the journal, this one showing investment records that demonstrated a level of financial sophistication that none of her children had associated with their parents' lifestyle. "Your father didn't trust traditional financial advisors," Dorothy continued. "He preferred to research investment opportunities himself, focusing on companies whose engineering and technological innovations he could evaluate from a technical perspective." Jonathan studied the investment records, recognizing company names that had become major technology corporations over the decades. "Dad invested in tech companies?" "Your father invested in engineering solutions," Dorothy corrected. "Companies developing innovative materials, manufacturing processes, infrastructure technologies. He understood their technical merit before their financial potential became obvious to typical investors." Marcus whistled softly as he examined entries showing early investments in companies that had since become household names. "These investments must be worth considerably more than their original purchase prices," Dorothy agreed. "Your father's approach to investment selection proved to be remarkably prescient." She closed the journal and reached for another document from her portfolio, this one showing current portfolio valuations that made her children's eyes widen with disbelief. "The education fund, as it exists today, has a current value of approximately $2.3 million, she announced, with the calm precision of someone reading weather statistics. The silence that followed was profound. Jonathan's mouth opened and closed soundlessly as he processed the figure. Amanda sat back in her chair as if the number had physical weight. Marcus simply stared at the portfolio statement, unable to formulate a response. Patricia was the first to find her voice. $2.3 million? Accumulated over 32 years of patent revenues and carefully selected investments, Dorothy confirmed. All designated specifically for family educational purposes. Jonathan finally managed to speak, though his voice came out hoarse with shock. Mom, that's enough money to solve all of your immediate financial problems and fund comprehensive rehabilitation of your various business and career situations, Dorothy finished. Which brings us back to the $847,000 figure I mentioned earlier. She opened another document showing detailed calculations that broke down the total education fund into specific allocations for each child's needs. However, she continued with the tone of someone preparing to deliver the most important part of a complex lesson. There are conditions attached to these resources that reflect your father's original intentions and my own analysis of what would actually help you achieve long-term financial stability. Amanda leaned forward eagerly. What kind of conditions? Dorothy's expression became serious, carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades managing complex systems and understanding long-term consequences. First, the funds can only be accessed for genuine educational purposes, which includes career retraining, business education, and skill development that addresses the root causes of your financial problems rather than just the symptoms. She pulled out individual folders for each child, each containing detailed educational and development plans. Second, access to funds requires commitment to structured learning programs that will prevent repetition of the financial mistakes that created your current situations. Marcus examined his folder, finding detailed recommendations for business management courses, mentorship programs, and even psychological counseling to address what Dorothy had identified as his pattern of avoiding long-term planning. Third, the funds are released incrementally as you demonstrate progress in developing the skills and habits necessary for sustained financial responsibility. Jonathan studied his folder, discovering a comprehensive program for business operational improvement that combined his engineering background with formal business management education. And fourth, Dorothy continued, her voice taking on the gravity of someone delivering an ultimatum, the funds remain hidden and inaccessible if you continue to believe that my memory is failing and that I need to be placed in professional care. The final condition hung in the air like a mathematical proof that had just been completed. Dorothy's children found themselves facing a choice that was far more complex than the simple intervention they'd planned. They could continue with their original agenda, convincing themselves and others that their mother needed memory care, in which case the education fund would remain hidden and their individual financial crises would continue to deteriorate. Or they could acknowledge that their assumptions about her declining faculties had been completely wrong, except that she was not only mentally sharp but financially sophisticated beyond anything they'd imagined, and agree to participate in educational programs designed to address their fundamental financial planning deficiencies. The choice, Dorothy said quietly, is entirely yours. But I should mention that the education fund is currently hidden in locations that only I know, secured in ways that would be impossible to access without my active cooperation. Patricia looked up from her notes with the expression of someone who'd just realized the true scope of the evening's revelations. You've hidden $2.3 million? Dorothy smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully completed a very complex project. I've secured family educational resources in locations where they'll remain safe from impulsive decision-making, including my own, until they can be deployed in ways that serve their intended purpose. She stood and moved back to the bay window, where the last light of evening was fading into darkness. The question you need to answer tonight is whether you're willing to abandon your assumptions about my declining memory in favor of accepting my enhanced planning capabilities. Behind her, she could hear the sound of her children whispering among themselves, apparently trying to process the choice they'd been given. What had begun as an intervention to address their mother's supposed mental decline had become a negotiation about their own willingness to acknowledge her competence and accept help in addressing their financial problems. Dorothy found herself almost amused by the reversal. They'd come here believing they needed to take control of her decisions for her own good. Instead, they'd discovered that she'd been taking control of their financial futures for theirs. The education fund existed, hidden and secured exactly as she'd claimed. Whether they'd ever see any of it depended on their willingness to accept that their supposedly failing mother was actually the most financially sophisticated person in the room. The whispered conversation between her children had lasted nearly 10 minutes, and Dorothy could hear the emotional tenor shifting from disbelief to calculation to something approaching panic. She remained at the bay window, ostensibly admiring her evening garden, but actually observing their reflection in the glass as they huddled around the dining table like war cabinet members trying to navigate an impossible strategic situation. Jonathan was clearly attempting to assert leadership, his legal training manifesting in what appeared to be systematic analysis of their options. Amanda kept gesturing toward the financial documents, her artistic temperament struggling with the mathematical precision of their mother's revelations. Marcus, meanwhile, seemed caught between relief at the prospect of financial salvation and bewilderment at how completely he'd misjudged his mother's capabilities. Patricia had stopped taking notes entirely and was staring at the portfolio statements with the expression of someone trying to reconcile irreconcilable realities. The numbers on the page represented more money than any of them had imagined their family possessed, hidden by someone they'd been planning to declare mentally incompetent less than 2 hours earlier. Dorothy turned from the window and settled back into her chair, noting how the dynamics in the room had fundamentally shifted. Her children were no longer speaking to her with the patronizing care reserved for cognitive decline. They were whispering about her with the nervous respect typically accorded to people who held significant power over their futures. "Have you reached any conclusions?" she asked, her voice carrying the calm patience of a professor allowing students time to work through a particularly challenging problem. Jonathan cleared his throat and straightened in his chair, apparently having been elected as the family spokesperson. "Mom, we need to ask some direct questions about what you've told us tonight." "I'd be disappointed if you didn't," Dorothy replied. "Critical thinking has always been important in this family." "First," Jonathan continued, his lawyer instincts asserting themselves, "are you saying that you've had access to over $2 million in family assets while watching us struggle with financial problems, and you chose not to help us?" Dorothy had anticipated this question and had prepared her response carefully. "I'm saying that I've been developing comprehensive solutions to your financial problems while you've been hiding those problems from me and from each other. There's a significant difference between withholding help and providing help in a way that actually addresses root causes rather than enabling destructive patterns." Amanda spoke up, her voice carrying a mixture of frustration and hope. "But Mom, if you knew we were in trouble, why didn't you just tell us about the education fund? We could have worked together to figure out solutions." "Could you have?" Dorothy asked mildly. "Because based on my observations, none of you have demonstrated particular skill at working together on complex problems. Each of you has been managing your financial crises in isolation, apparently unaware that your siblings were facing similar challenges." The observation landed with uncomfortable accuracy. Marcus shifted in his chair, realizing that his mother was right. He'd been so focused on hiding his own financial disasters that he'd never considered whether Jonathan or Amanda might be struggling with similar problems. "More importantly," Dorothy continued, "the three of you arrived here tonight with a plan to declare me mentally incompetent and place me in professional care. That doesn't suggest people who were prepared to work collaboratively on complex family financial planning." Patricia leaned forward, her practical nature driving her toward the heart of the matter. "Mrs. Williams, what exactly do you want from us? What would convince you to make these funds accessible?" Dorothy appreciated the directness of the question, though she noted that Patricia was still framing the situation as a negotiation rather than acknowledging the fundamental error in their assumptions about her mental state. "What I want," Dorothy said carefully, "is acknowledgement that your assessment of my cognitive abilities was completely wrong, and commitment to educational programs that will prevent future financial crises, rather than simply postponing them." She pulled out another set of documents, these showing detailed curricula for business management, financial planning, and personal development programs, tailored to each child's specific needs and personality patterns. "Jonathan, your engineering background gives you excellent analytical skills, but you've never received formal training in business operations, marketing, or financial management. Your consulting firm's problems stem from treating business development as if it were an engineering problem, logical, systematic, predictable, when it actually requires skills you've never developed." Jonathan studied the educational program Dorothy had designed for him, recognizing course recommendations from respected business schools, executive development programs, and even specific mentorship opportunities with successful consulting firm owners. Amanda, your artistic talent and design skills are exceptional, but your business has suffered because you've never learned to separate creative decision-making from financial decision-making. You treat every project as an artistic challenge rather than a business transaction, which creates cash flow problems that no amount of talent can solve. Amanda examined her curriculum, finding courses in business management for creative professionals, financial planning specifically designed for service businesses, and even psychological counseling to address what Dorothy had identified as her tendency to undervalue her own work. And Marcus, Dorothy continued, turning to her youngest son, your entrepreneurial enthusiasm is admirable, but you've been starting businesses based on personal interests rather than market analysis. Every venture has failed because you've never learned to distinguish between hobbies that bring you joy and business opportunities that generate sustainable income. Marcus looked through his educational plan, discovering it included not just business courses, but career counseling, psychological evaluation for what appeared to be attention and planning deficits, and structured mentorship with successful entrepreneurs who'd overcome similar challenges. These programs, Dorothy explained, are designed to address the systematic problems that created your current financial situations. Simply providing money without addressing those underlying issues would be like treating symptoms while ignoring the disease. Jonathan set down his educational plan and looked directly at his mother. Mom, this is incredibly thoughtful and comprehensive planning, but it's also controlling behavior that goes far beyond normal family support. Dorothy nodded approvingly. An excellent observation, Jonathan. It is controlling behavior. The question is whether it's appropriate control exercised by someone with superior knowledge and resources, or inappropriate control exercised by someone whose judgment can't be trusted. She stood and moved to Robert's desk again, this time opening a different drawer and withdrawing what appeared to be legal documents. Which brings us to the central question you need to answer tonight, she continued, returning to the table with papers that looked like formal contracts. Are you prepared to acknowledge that I'm mentally competent to make decisions about family financial resources, or do you still believe I need professional care for memory problems? The documents she placed on the table were clearly legal agreements, written in the formal language of contracts and witnessed by what appeared to be notarized signatures. If you choose to continue believing that I'm experiencing cognitive decline, Dorothy explained, then logically you should proceed with your plan to seek guardianship or conservatorship. In that case, these documents ensure that the education fund remains secured and inaccessible, to be donated to Yale University's mathematics department upon my death. Amanda gasped audibly. You'd give it all away? I'd ensure that family educational resources serve educational purposes, Dorothy corrected. If my own family believes I'm incompetent to manage those resources, then they're probably right that I shouldn't be making decisions about distributing them. Marcus leaned forward, his usual casual demeanor replaced by intense focus. But if we acknowledge that you're mentally competent, then these contracts become void, Dorothy finished, and the education fund becomes available for its intended purpose, providing structured educational support that addresses your individual needs while ensuring long-term financial stability. Jonathan picked up one of the contracts, his legal training automatically analyzing the language and structure. Mom, these are professionally drafted legal documents. When did you have these prepared? 6 months ago, Dorothy replied, when I first realized that my behavioral changes might be misinterpreted as cognitive decline rather than intense focus on complex problem-solving. She sat back down, her expression serious but not unkind. I needed to ensure that the education fund would be protected regardless of what conclusions my family reached about my mental state. Patricia looked up from studying the contracts with growing amazement. Mrs. Williams, you've been planning this entire scenario for months. I've been planning optimal outcomes for various possible scenarios, Dorothy corrected. Tonight's intervention was just one possibility, though I suspected it was becoming increasingly likely as your individual financial pressures continued to mount. The room fell silent as the full scope of Dorothy's strategic thinking became clear. She hadn't simply been monitoring their financial problems. She'd been anticipating their likely responses to those problems and preparing comprehensive contingency plans for multiple possible outcomes. So our choice, Amanda said slowly, is between acknowledging that we were completely wrong about your mental state or losing access to resources that could solve all of our financial problems. Your choice, Dorothy corrected gently, is between continuing to base your decisions on assumptions that have proven to be incorrect, or accepting evidence that suggests different conclusions. She gestured toward the educational planning documents. The resources exist regardless of your choice. The question is whether they'll be used to help you develop the skills necessary for long-term financial stability, or donated to an institution that will use them for educational purposes that don't directly benefit your family. Marcus looked around the table at his siblings, recognizing that they'd reached a decision point that would define their relationships with their mother and with each other for years to come. "Mom," he said quietly, "I think we owe you an apology. We came here tonight believing we were helping you, but we were actually insulting you based on assumptions we never bothered to verify." Jonathan nodded slowly, his engineering mind finally accepting the mathematical elegance of their mother's planning. "We completely misjudged your capabilities and your intentions." Amanda reached across the table to touch Dorothy's hand. "I'm sorry, Mom. We should have asked you directly about what we were observing, instead of making assumptions about what it meant." Dorothy felt a mixture of relief and sadness as she heard their acknowledgments. She'd hoped this moment would feel like vindication, but instead it felt like the resolution of a problem that should never have developed in the first place. "Apologies accepted," she said simply. "But the more important question is whether you're willing to participate in the educational programs that will help you avoid future financial crises." Patricia looked up from the contracts with a new question. "Mrs. Williams, if we agree to these programs, how long would they take? And what happens to our immediate financial problems while we're developing these new skills?" Dorothy smiled, appreciating the practical planning focus of the question. "The emergency components of each program can be implemented immediately: debt consolidation, cash flow stabilization, business operational improvements. The longer-term educational development happens in parallel with crisis resolution, not instead of it." She pulled out timeline documents showing how emergency financial support would be coordinated with skill development programs over 18 to 24 months. "The goal," she explained, "is to solve your immediate problems while building capabilities that will prevent similar problems from developing in the future." Jonathan studied the timeline, recognizing the sophisticated project management approach his mother had applied to their family's financial rehabilitation. "This is remarkably comprehensive planning, Mom. It's mathematics applied to family dynamics," Dorothy replied. "Complex systems require systematic solutions if you want sustainable outcomes." Marcus looked around the table again, seeing his siblings' expressions shifting from resistance to acceptance to something approaching gratitude. "I think," he said carefully, "we need to formally acknowledge that we were wrong about your memory, your mental state, and your capabilities. And we need to accept your help with the educational programs you've designed." Jonathan and Amanda nodded in agreement, their expressions showing the mixture of embarrassment and relief that came with recognizing they'd been offered a solution to problems they'd been struggling with alone. "In that case," Dorothy said, standing and moving toward the secretary desk one final time, "I think it's time to show you where I've been keeping your educational funds secure." Her children watched with growing anticipation as their mother prepared to reveal the locations where she'd hidden nearly $2.5 million in family assets, money that had existed all along, waiting for the moment when they'd be ready to use it responsibly. Dorothy moved to Robert's antique secretary desk with the measured pace of someone savoring a moment she'd been anticipating for months. Her children watched in rapt silence as she began manipulating the desk's intricate mechanisms, sliding panels, pressing hidden springs, and accessing compartments that had remained invisible despite decades of family use. "Your father was fascinated by this desk's engineering," she said, her fingers working with practiced precision along what appeared to be solid wood surfaces. 17 hidden compartments, each accessible only through specific sequences of pressure points and sliding mechanisms. A small panel slid away to reveal a narrow space containing what looked like safety deposit box keys and detailed maps of Connecticut marked with precise coordinates. "The education fund isn't sitting in traditional bank accounts where it could be easily discovered or accessed," Dorothy explained, withdrawing the first set of documents. "It's been distributed across multiple secure locations, each chosen for specific strategic advantages. Jonathan leaned forward, his engineering background immediately appreciating the mechanical complexity of the desk's hidden systems. How many locations? Dorothy consulted what appeared to be a master list written in her own careful handwriting. 7 primary locations, 3 backup positions, and 2 emergency access points. The distribution was calculated to optimize security while maintaining accessibility for legitimate educational purposes. She opened another hidden compartment, this one containing what appeared to be specialized equipment, small metal detectors, GPS devices, and tools that looked designed for precision excavation work. Location 1, Dorothy announced, spreading a detailed map across the table, is the Yale University Mathematics Library, Special Collections Vault. Your father maintained research privileges there until his death, and I've continued those privileges through my emeritus status. Amanda stared at the map, which showed detailed floor plans of the library building with specific locations marked in red ink. You hid money in the university library? I deposited carefully sealed containers in research storage areas where they're protected by university security, but accessible to authorized researchers, Dorothy clarified. The materials are cataloged as Chen-Williams Family Mathematical Archive, which is technically accurate, since they contain calculations related to family financial planning. Marcus whistled softly. How much is hidden there? Dorothy consulted her master list. Approximately $347,000 in bearer bonds and precious metal certificates. The university's storage provides optimal security with legal access protocols that don't require disclosure of specific contents. She moved to the next location on her list, pulling out detailed photographs of what appeared to be a private residence's basement workshop. Location 2 is considerably more creative, she continued with obvious satisfaction. Robert's workshop in our basement contains engineered storage systems that he designed using his materials expertise. Jonathan's eyes widened. Dad built hiding places in the workshop? Your father constructed what appear to be standard workshop storage containers but are actually sophisticated security systems using techniques from his industrial engineering background, Dorothy explained, showing photographs of ordinary-looking toolboxes and equipment cases. The containers require specific knowledge of pressure sequences and weight distributions to open without triggering destruction mechanisms. She demonstrated with a small model she withdrew from the desk, showing how what looked like a simple metal box actually contained multiple layers of security that would destroy the contents if opened incorrectly. These containers hold approximately $428,000 in various forms: rare coin collections, industrial precious metals, and high-value certificates that are virtually untraceable, but easily liquidated by someone with proper knowledge. Patricia shook her head in amazement. Your husband was more than just an engineer. Robert understood that true security required engineering solutions, rather than relying on traditional financial institutions. Dorothy replied. He designed these systems specifically to protect family resources from both external threats and internal poor judgment. She consulted her list again, moving to location 3. The third major deposit is the most audacious, and probably the most secure. Dorothy withdrew what appeared to be official documentation from a Connecticut state agency, along with detailed maps of what looked like public parkland. Westfield Commons Municipal Park, she announced, specifically the area around the Memorial Garden that Robert helped design in 1987. Marcus blinked in confusion. You buried money in the public park? We contributed to the Memorial Garden's construction, Dorothy explained, and Robert's engineering expertise was utilized in designing the foundation systems for the memorial stones and landscaping features. During construction, he incorporated additional structural elements that served dual purposes. She showed them engineering diagrams that revealed how certain memorial features had been constructed with hidden storage capabilities built into their foundations. The memorial stones themselves contain sealed chambers accessible through removable foundation elements that appear to be permanent construction, Dorothy continued. The storage areas are protected by the memorial's official status and regular municipal maintenance, making them virtually impossible to discover without specific knowledge of the construction details. Jonathan studied the engineering diagrams with growing appreciation for his father's systematic approach to family security. How much is stored there? Approximately $511,000, Dorothy replied. The largest single deposit, reflecting the superior security of a location that's hidden in plain sight and protected by municipal authority. Amanda was staring at the memorial garden photographs with an expression mixing awe and disbelief. I've walked through that memorial hundreds of times. I never imagined. That was the point, Dorothy said simply. The best security systems are invisible to people who don't know they exist. She moved to the final major location, withdrawing documentation that appeared to involve legal safe deposit arrangements with multiple financial institutions. Locations 4 through 7 involve traditional safe deposit facilities, she explained, but distributed across different banks using legal entities that Robert established for specific purposes. The documentation showed a complex network of trusts, limited partnerships, and individual accounts that had been created to compartmentalize access to different portions of the education fund. The advantages of distribution, Dorothy continued, include redundancy if any single location becomes compromised, legal complexity that makes unauthorized access nearly impossible, and tax optimization strategies that maximize the fund's growth potential. Marcus examined the trust documents, recognizing sophisticated legal structures that went far beyond typical family financial planning. Mom, this is like something out of a spy novel. It's systematic protection of family resources using available legal and engineering tools, Dorothy corrected. Your father approached family security the same way he approached any engineering challenge, by identifying potential failure points and designing systems that remain functional even when individual components fail. Patricia looked up from studying the location documentation with a new question. Mrs. Williams, with all these security measures and hidden locations, how do we actually access the funds when they're needed for the educational programs? Dorothy smiled, reaching into the desk's final hidden compartment to withdraw what appeared to be detailed instruction manuals for each location. Access requires knowledge of specific procedures for each location, plus verification of legitimate educational purposes through the programs I've designed, she explained. The system ensures that funds can only be retrieved for their intended purposes by people who understand both the security protocols and the educational objectives. She handed each of her children instruction packets specific to their individual educational plans, showing how access to different funding levels would be coordinated with completion of specific program milestones. The beauty of the distribution system, Dorothy concluded, is that it provides multiple layers of security, while ensuring that educational resources remain available for people who demonstrate genuine commitment to learning and financial responsibility. Jonathan set down his instruction packet and looked at his mother with newfound respect. Mom, you and Dad created something remarkable. This isn't just financial planning, it's a comprehensive system for family development. Dorothy nodded, satisfied that her children were beginning to understand the scope of what Robert had envisioned and what she had implemented. The education fund was never just about money. It was about creating opportunities for continuous learning and growth, while protecting those opportunities from impulsive decisions or external threats. She began gathering the location documents back into the desk's hidden compartments, her movements revealing the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been managing these systems for years. Now, she said, settling back into her chair with the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully completed a complex presentation, we can begin implementing the educational programs that will help you develop the skills necessary for long-term financial stability. The evening had transformed from intervention to revelation to education, and Dorothy found herself looking forward to watching her children discover capabilities they'd never known they possessed, just as they'd discovered capabilities in her that they'd never imagined existed. Part 7. The Implementation. 3 weeks after the intervention that had transformed into an education, Dorothy sat in her study surrounded by progress reports, enrollment confirmations, and detailed financial tracking spreadsheets that documented the most ambitious family rehabilitation project she'd ever undertaken. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating documents that represented the systematic implementation of everything she'd planned during those months of supposed memory decline. Her children had approached their educational commitments with varying degrees of enthusiasm and resistance, but all three had begun the programs with an urgency driven by their desperate financial circumstances and growing respect for their mother's strategic capabilities. Jonathan had been the first to fully embrace the structured approach, his engineering background responding well to Dorothy's systematic methodology. He'd enrolled in an executive MBA program specifically designed for technical professionals transitioning into business leadership, while simultaneously working with a business consultant who specialized in engineering firm operations. "The cash flow analysis you provided was incredibly accurate," he'd told Dorothy during their weekly progress meeting. "Our consultant confirmed that the operational changes you identified would have prevented most of our current problems." Dorothy had smiled at the acknowledgement, though she'd been careful not to express satisfaction too obviously. Jonathan's pride had taken a significant blow when he'd realized how completely he'd misjudged both his business situation and his mother's capabilities. The immediate financial relief for his consulting firm had come from Location 4, a safe deposit facility in Hartford, where Dorothy had stored $180,000 in bonds specifically earmarked for business operational emergencies. The funds had been released after Jonathan completed the first phase of his business education program and demonstrated understanding of the cash flow management principles that had contributed to his firm's crisis. The release process was ingenious, Jonathan had admitted to his sisters. "Mom made me present a complete operational analysis of my firm's problems and propose solutions before she'd provide access to emergency funding. I learned more about business management in 2 weeks than I had in 20 years of running my own company." Amanda's journey had proven more emotionally challenging, requiring her to confront deeply ingrained patterns of undervaluing her own work and treating business transactions as personal relationships. Dorothy had connected her with a specialized program for creative professionals that combined business education with psychological counseling, designed to address the self-worth issues that had contributed to her chronic underpricing of design services. "I never realized how much my pricing problems were connected to my fear of being rejected or criticized," Amanda had confessed during one of their family progress meetings. "I was basically paying clients to accept my work instead of charging them fairly for valuable services." The $94,000 Dorothy had accessed from the Memorial Garden location had been used to stabilize Amanda's business operations, pay off the most pressing supplier debts, and fund a complete restructuring of her client contract processes. But more importantly, the psychological counseling component of her program was helping her develop the confidence necessary to run a profitable business, rather than an expensive hobby. "The contracts I'm negotiating now include clear scope definitions, change order procedures, and payment schedules that protect my cash flow," Amanda had reported with obvious pride. "My new clients are actually more respectful of my work now that I'm pricing it appropriately." Marcus had presented the greatest challenge, requiring the most comprehensive intervention to address what Dorothy had identified as attention and planning deficits that had contributed to his pattern of failed business ventures. His educational program included psychological evaluation, career counseling, and a structured mentorship with a successful entrepreneur who had overcome similar challenges. The psychological testing revealed some learning differences that explained why traditional business planning never worked for me, Marcus had explained to Dorothy with relief rather than embarrassment. "I wasn't lazy or irresponsible. I was trying to use planning methods that weren't compatible with how my brain actually processes information." The $73,000 Dorothy had retrieved from Robert's workshop containers had been used for Marcus's debt consolidation and living expenses, while he participated in an intensive 6-month program designed to help adults with attention deficits develop successful business strategies. The program included both practical business education and psychological support for developing the organizational systems Marcus needed to sustain long-term planning. "For the first time in my life, I'm learning business strategies that actually make sense to me," Marcus had told his family during a recent progress meeting. "Instead of fighting against my natural thinking patterns, I'm learning to work with them productively." But the most significant transformation had been in the family dynamics themselves. The revelation of Dorothy's sophisticated planning capabilities and hidden resources had forced all 3 children to completely reevaluate their assumptions about aging, competence, and family relationships. Patricia had been particularly vocal about the broader implications of what they'd discovered. "I keep thinking about how close we came to making a catastrophic mistake," she'd confided to Dorothy during a private conversation. "If we'd succeeded in convincing someone that you needed memory care, we would have not only damaged you but also destroyed opportunities that could transform our entire family's future. Dorothy had appreciated Patricia's reflection, recognizing that her daughter-in-law's medical background made her particularly sensitive to the ethical implications of their original intervention plan. The incident has made me much more careful about distinguishing between behavioral observations and medical conclusions, Patricia had continued. We saw what we expected to see instead of investigating what we were actually observing. The weekly family meetings Dorothy had instituted as part of the educational program had created unprecedented communication between siblings who'd spent decades managing their problems in isolation. Jonathan, Amanda, and Marcus were sharing information about their challenges and successes in ways that were generating mutual support rather than competition or judgment. It's strange, Amanda had observed during a recent meeting, but working on our individual problems together has actually made each of us more successful than we were trying to solve everything alone. Dorothy had nodded approvingly at the observation, recognizing that collaborative problem-solving had always been one of the intended outcomes of her systematic approach to family financial rehabilitation. The progress-tracking spreadsheets on her desk told a story of measurable improvement across multiple dimensions. Jonathan's consulting firm had stabilized its cash flow and was beginning to show steady growth for the first time in 2 years. Amanda's design business had achieved positive monthly cash flow and was building a client base that valued and properly compensated her work. Marcus had completed his psychological evaluation and career assessment and was developing a business plan that built on his actual strengths rather than his imagined interests. But perhaps most importantly, all 3 children were demonstrating financial responsibility and planning capabilities that had been notably absent from their previous approaches to money management. The educational programs aren't just teaching us business skills, Jonathan had noted during their most recent family meeting. They're teaching us how to think systematically about long-term consequences instead of just responding to immediate pressures. Dorothy had been particularly pleased with this observation, recognizing that systematic thinking was the foundation of sustainable financial stability. The specific business and career skills her children were learning would serve them well, but the underlying cognitive approaches they were developing would prevent future crises even as circumstances changed. The implementation phase had also revealed the full scope of Robert's forward-thinking financial strategy. As Dorothy had systematically access to different hiding locations to fund various aspects of the educational programs, she discovered additional resources that even she hadn't fully cataloged. Your father apparently continued adding to the education fund even after his retirement, she'd told her children during a recent progress review. I found additional deposits in the Memorial Garden location that bring the total available resources to nearly $2.7 million. The expanded fund meant that Dorothy could implement even more comprehensive educational and career development programs, including advanced degree funding for grandchildren and extended family members who demonstrated commitment to serious learning. Dad really was thinking decades ahead, Marcus had marveled when Dorothy had shown them Robert's detailed projections for education funding needs extending into the 2040s. The revelation had prompted all 3 children to begin thinking more seriously about their own long-term family planning responsibilities, including how they might contribute to educational resources for the next generation. As Dorothy reviewed the progress reports spread across her desk, she found herself experiencing a satisfaction that went beyond mathematical precision or strategic success. The educational programs were working not just because they addressed her children's immediate financial problems, but because they were helping them develop capabilities that would serve them throughout their lives. Jonathan was discovering leadership and business development skills that were transforming his consulting firm from a struggling practice into a growing enterprise. Amanda was developing confidence and business acumen that were allowing her artistic talents to flourish within sustainable business structures. Marcus was learning planning and organizational methods that were helping him channel his entrepreneurial energy into realistic and achievable ventures. But most importantly, all 3 were learning to approach problems collaboratively and systematically, using the kinds of analytical thinking that had always been Dorothy's strength but had somehow failed to transfer to her children during their younger years. The irony, Dorothy had confided to her neighbor Mrs. Henderson during a recent garden conversation, is that my children are finally learning the problem-solving approaches I tried to teach them when they were students. It just took a family financial crisis and a pretend intervention to create the motivation for serious learning. Mrs. Henderson had laughed at the observation, noting that Dorothy's supposed memory problems had been the talk of the neighborhood until recently, when the children's dramatically improved circumstances had suggested a different explanation for their mother's behavioral changes. "We all assumed you were declining," Mrs. Henderson had admitted, "when you were actually planning the most sophisticated family improvement project any of us had ever seen." As Dorothy organized the progress reports for the next family meeting, she reflected on how completely the situation had transformed from the disastrous intervention her children had originally planned. They'd arrived believing they needed to protect her from her own declining capabilities, and instead, they'd discovered resources and opportunities that were protecting them from the consequences of their own financial mistakes. The education fund was serving its intended purpose, providing structured learning opportunities that were developing capabilities rather than just solving immediate problems. But perhaps more importantly, the process was rebuilding family relationships based on accurate understanding and mutual respect, rather than assumptions and patronizing concern. The evening's family meeting would focus on long-term planning as her children approached the completion of their initial educational program phases. Dorothy was looking forward to discussing how they might use their newly developed skills to contribute to family financial strategies, rather than just benefiting from them. The intervention had become an education, and the education was becoming a foundation for sustained family success that extended far beyond the immediate financial crises that had originally motivated their gathering around her dining room table. 6 months after the infamous family dinner that had changed everything, Dorothy stood in the expanded workshop that had once been Robert's private domain, watching her 3 children collaborate on a project that would have been impossible during their previous lives of financial chaos and mutual isolation. The basement space hummed with productive energy as Jonathan's engineering expertise, Amanda's design sensibilities, and Marcus's newfound organizational skills converged on something none of them could have accomplished individually. The workshop itself had been transformed from a hiding place for secret funds into a collaborative workspace where the family was developing what Jonathan had dubbed the Chen-Williams financial security model, a comprehensive system for multi-generational wealth building and education funding that built on Robert's original innovations while incorporating lessons learned from their own financial rehabilitation. The beauty of Dad's original system, Jonathan was explaining to a small video camera that Amanda had set up to document their work, was that it protected family resources from both external threats and internal poor judgment. But what we're developing goes beyond protection. It's designed to actively generate opportunities for continuous learning and capability development. Dorothy smiled as she watched her eldest son demonstrate the modified workshop containers that now served as prototype storage systems for other families interested in implementing similar financial security strategies. Jonathan's consulting firm had pivoted from traditional engineering services to specialized financial security consulting, combining his technical background with the business management skills he'd developed through Dorothy's educational program. The transformation in his professional confidence was remarkable. Where once he'd struggled to price his services appropriately and manage cash flow effectively, Jonathan now commanded premium fees for sophisticated financial security consulting that integrated engineering principles with advanced business strategy. "We've had inquiries from 17 families in the past month," he'd reported during their most recent family meeting. "Apparently, word is spreading about comprehensive approaches to family financial planning that go beyond traditional investment management." Amanda moved around the workshop with the graceful efficiency she'd developed since restructuring her design business according to sustainable principles. She was documenting the visual aspects of their security system development, but more importantly, she was applying her artistic training to create elegant solutions for complex logistical problems. "The aesthetic component is crucial," she was saying to the camera as she adjusted lighting for optimal documentation of their prototypes. "Financial security systems need to be beautiful and personally meaningful, not just functional. When people take pride in their family's planning systems, they're more likely to maintain them properly across multiple generations." Her design business had not only recovered from its near bankruptcy, but had expanded into a specialized niche serving high-net-worth families who wanted their financial planning infrastructure to reflect their personal values and aesthetic preferences. Amanda's newfound confidence in pricing her services appropriately had resulted in a client base that valued and respected her unique combination of artistic talent and business acumen. Marcus sat at a newly installed workbench, his attention focused on detailed planning documents that would have been impossible for him to create before his psychological evaluation and specialized education. The organizational systems he'd learned were specifically designed for adults with attention differences, and they'd transformed his approach to both personal and professional planning, from chaotic improvisation to systematic effectiveness. The documentation protocols are critical, he was explaining to the camera while demonstrating the record-keeping systems they'd developed. Dad's original approach protected the resources, but it relied too heavily on individual knowledge that could be lost if something happened to the person who'd created the systems. Marcus had discovered that his learning differences, when properly understood and accommodated, actually provided advantages for certain types of strategic thinking. His ability to see patterns and connections that others missed had made him invaluable in designing redundancy and backup systems that ensured family financial security systems could survive unexpected circumstances. His new career as a strategic consultant for family business succession planning was generating steady income while utilizing his natural strengths in ways that his previous entrepreneurial ventures never had. Dorothy settled into the comfortable chair they'd installed for her supervisory role in their collaborative projects, noting how the basement workshop had evolved from Robert's private refuge into a space that embodied everything they'd learned about family cooperation and systematic planning. The video documentation they were creating would eventually become part of a comprehensive educational program they were developing for other families interested in implementing similar financial security and education funding strategies. The project represented the culmination of everything they'd learned during their individual rehabilitation programs, but applied to a purpose that served others rather than just addressing their own problems. The fundamental insight, Dorothy said, addressing the camera directly, is that financial security isn't primarily about accumulating money. It's about developing capabilities that make money serve family values and long-term objectives, rather than just immediate wants. She gestured toward the charts and planning documents that covered the workshop walls, showing the systematic approach they'd developed for identifying and developing individual family members' capabilities, while protecting collective resources. Robert's original education fund was designed to solve a specific problem, ensuring that our children could pursue learning opportunities without financial constraints, she continued. But what we've discovered is that the principles behind that solution can be applied much more broadly. The walls of the workshop displayed before and after analyses of their family's financial situation that told a story of transformation that went far beyond mere numbers. 6 months earlier, Jonathan's consulting firm had been 97 days from bankruptcy. Now it was booked solid with high-value clients and had a waiting list for services. Amanda's design business had evolved from a cash flow crisis into a profitable enterprise with a reputation for innovative solutions to complex aesthetic challenges. Marcus had progressed from chronic unemployment and debt accumulation to stable income and systematic debt elimination ahead of his original timeline. But the financial improvements, significant as they were, represented only the surface level of what had changed. The deeper transformation was visible in how they approached problems, made decisions, and related to each other as family members. The most important outcome, Patricia had observed during a recent family meeting, isn't that everyone's businesses are doing better, though that's wonderful. It's that you've all learned to think systematically about long-term consequences instead of just reacting to immediate pressures. Dorothy had been particularly pleased with Patricia's observation, recognizing that systematic thinking was indeed the foundation of everything else they'd accomplished. The specific business and financial skills her children had developed were valuable, but the underlying cognitive approaches they'd learned would serve them well regardless of how their circumstances might change in the future. Amanda moved to a different section of the workshop where they'd been developing what she called inheritance transition protocols, systematic approaches for preparing the next generation to receive and manage family resources responsibly. One of the biggest insights we've gained, Amanda was explaining to the camera, is that traditional inheritance planning often fails because it focuses on transferring money without transferring the capabilities necessary to manage that money effectively. The protocols they were developing addressed this problem by creating structured learning experiences that prepared potential inheritors to understand and manage complex financial systems before they gained access to significant resources. Our nieces and nephews, she continued, referring to the grandchildren who were now beneficiaries of the expanded education fund, are participating in age-appropriate financial education programs that teach them to think systematically about money and planning from early ages. Dorothy watched with satisfaction as Amanda demonstrated educational materials they'd developed for different age groups, from elementary school children learning basic concepts of saving and planning to teenagers participating in sophisticated simulations of business and investment decision-making. The grandchildren's education was being funded from the additional resources Dorothy had discovered in Robert's Memorial Garden deposits, but more importantly, it was being guided by principles that emphasized capability development over simple resource transfer. Marcus looked up from his documentation work to add his perspective to Amanda's explanation. The key insight is that financial education needs to be experiential rather than theoretical. We're creating opportunities for the kids to make real decisions about real money, with real consequences, but within protective frameworks that make failure educational rather than devastating. The wisdom embedded in Marcus's observation reflected how much his own thinking had evolved since beginning his specialized education program. His understanding of learning processes, particularly for individuals with attention differences, had contributed valuable insights to their family education system development. Jonathan moved to the workshop's central workspace, where they'd assembled a comprehensive model of the financial security system they were developing for other families. The model integrated Robert's original engineering approaches with everything they'd learned about business management, psychological factors in financial decision-making, and multi-generational planning strategies. What we're creating, Jonathan explained to the camera, is essentially a toolkit that other families can adapt to their specific circumstances and values. The principles are universal, but the implementation needs to be customized based on individual family dynamics and capabilities. Dorothy stood and moved to join her children around the central workspace, feeling a profound sense of completion as she observed the synthesis of everything Robert had envisioned, with everything their family had learned through their own crisis and recovery. The irony, she said, addressing the camera directly, is that our family's greatest educational experience came from what we initially perceived as our greatest crisis. My children's financial problems, which seemed like failures at the time, actually created the motivation for learning that had been missing from their earlier lives. She gestured toward the comprehensive planning materials that surrounded them, representing months of intensive collaboration and systematic development. Robert always believed that the most valuable inheritance we could provide wasn't money but capabilities, Dorothy continued. What we've discovered is that developing those capabilities often requires challenges that force people beyond their comfort zones and previous assumptions about what they can accomplish. Amanda nodded in agreement, recognizing how her own transformation from financially struggling artist to successful business owner had required confronting uncomfortable truths about her pricing, planning, and business management approaches. The educational programs Mom designed for us weren't just about learning business skills, she added. They were about developing confidence and systematic thinking that changed how we approached every aspect of our lives. Marcus looked around the workshop space that had become a symbol of their family's collaborative capabilities, reflecting on how different their relationships had become since the evening, when they'd planned to discuss their mother's supposed memory problems. The biggest change, he said thoughtfully, is that we've learned to see each other as resources rather than competitors. Instead of hiding our problems and struggles, we're sharing information and working together to develop solutions that benefit everyone. Jonathan consulted the timeline documents that track their progress over the past 6 months, noting milestones that measured not just financial improvements but capability development and family relationship enhancement. Looking at our progress objectively, he said with the analytical precision that characterized his engineering background, what we've accomplished represents a fundamental transformation in how our family approaches challenges and opportunities. Dorothy settled back into her chair, surrounded by evidence of her family's systematic development and collaborative success, feeling the deep satisfaction that came from seeing complex plans achieve their intended outcomes. The question we're exploring now, she said to the camera, is how to help other families avoid the crisis phase of this process while still achieving the learning and capability development that made our transformation possible. The workshop fell quiet, except for the gentle hum of equipment and the scratching of pens as her children continued their documentation work. Dorothy looked around the space that had evolved from Robert's private workshop into a collaborative center for family development, recognizing that they'd created something that honored his original vision while extending it in directions he probably never imagined. 6 months earlier, her children had arrived at her dinner table, believing they needed to protect her from her declining capabilities. Instead, they'd discovered that she'd been protecting them from the consequences of their own underdeveloped capabilities, while creating opportunities for growth that none of them had imagined possible. The intervention had become an education, the education had become a transformation, and the transformation was becoming a legacy that would serve not just their own family, but others who were willing to approach financial security and family development with the same systematic dedication that Robert had brought to his engineering challenges. As Dorothy watched her children work together with the collaborative efficiency they'd developed over months of structured learning and shared problem-solving, she realized that Robert's greatest innovation hadn't been the hidden storage systems or the sophisticated investment strategies. His greatest innovation had been the understanding that true family security came from developing capabilities rather than just accumulating resources. The education fund had served its purpose, but the family's education was just beginning. And now they were prepared to help others discover what they'd learned, that the most valuable inheritance isn't money that's been saved, but wisdom that's been earned through systematic learning and collaborative growth. The workshop hummed with productive energy as three siblings who'd once hidden their problems from each other continued developing systems that would help other families transform their own challenges into opportunities for multi-generational success. Dorothy's supposedly failing memory had become the foundation for a family legacy that would extend far beyond the resources Robert had originally hidden, creating value that could be measured not just in dollars, but in the capabilities and relationships that truly determined family wealth. Outside the workshop windows, the Connecticut autumn painted the trees in brilliant colors, marking the passage of time and the arrival of a season that promised both completion and new beginnings. Inside, the Chen-Williams family continued their work, building on foundations that had been hidden in plain sight, creating opportunities that would serve generations yet to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.